Second story is about a very dear friend of mine. And many of you probably never even knew she existed. It's called Almost a Baroness, The Life of Evelyn May Carroll Durand. This story is brought to you by the book Yesteryear by Edith Louise Davison, written in 1986, and a collection of letters to Evelyn and photographs found many years ago in a very small suitcase at the Recycling Center in Moodus by Edward Thorold. Born on October 3rd, 1894, in Brooklyn, New York, Evelyn was the daughter of Thomas Howard Carroll, of Irish descent, and Edith Eliza Phelps of East Haddam. Her sister, Edith Louise, was born in 1898. Their father changed the family surname to Carroll sometime before they moved from Brooklyn to East Haddam. From 1900 to 1908, Eve was in elementary school. She and Edith loved to take the steamship to the East Haddam landing to visit their grandparents at the Phelps House on Town Street, which is still standing right next to the Historical Society Museum. It's that house right next door. Sometime between 1909 and 1913, when Eve was in private school at normal school, her father, who was a first assistant engineer on cargo steamships, moved the family permanently to the Phelps House in East Haddam, and he took Eve with him on a trip to the Panama Canal, which was being constructed at that time. Edith Louise made the same trip a few years later. By now, Eve has developed a love for traveling, especially on the sea. As a teenager, Eve was of slight build, very pretty, and loved to have her picture taken. Sister Edith was just the opposite. Eve caught the acting bug in her teens when Mrs. Allison, whose husband ran the drugstore across from the Gelston House, began putting on plays as the East Haddam Dramatic Club in the then empty Goodspeed Theater. Eve was frequently in the casts. Eve spent several months taking the train to Hartford to an orthodontist to have her teeth straightened. In early 1913, the year the Haddam to East Haddam Bridge was built, Eve, with her mother at the reins of their carriage, raced down to the ferry at Goodspeed's Landing. Upon arrival, they found that the ferry boat had already left to cross the ice-covered river. Not wanting to miss the train, the fearless Eve began to run across the ice towards Tylerville. When almost there, the ice began to disappear and crack under her feet. She was about to turn back when the ferry boat captain called out to her to wait. He lowered a small rowboat and rescued her and brought her ashore with just enough time to race to the train, which was starting to leave for Hartford. After collapsing in exhaustion in her seat, Eve later recalled remarking to herself that Eliza, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, crossing on the ice to freedom, had nothing on her. From 1913 to 1918, Eve attended Northfield Seminary for Girls in Massachusetts and Connecticut College in New London. Finally, after 2 years at Teachers College in Willimantic, she was ready for a career, but actually spent only 1 year as a second-grade teacher. In 1922, Eve and Edith decided to go on a tour of World War I battlefield sites in Belgium and France. They took the train to Montreal, where they boarded the steamship Benedosa for the trip to England. Then what was usually reserved for books and movies happened to Eve. She met Lieutenant Commander Mortimer Henry Marion Durand, who was executive officer of the ill-fated cruiser HMS Raleigh, which had just recently been wrecked off the coast of Labrador. He was on furlough, traveling back to England after service in the Royal Navy during World War I, from 1914 to 1919. They fell instantly in love, and the shipboard romance made all the newspapers here and abroad. Upon arrival in London, he proposed, She said yes, and they were married in a civil ceremony. However, in those days, permission had to be obtained from the parents. Both of the fathers had died in 1921, so Morty, as he was called, had to get his mother's permission, which was granted, and a large church wedding followed on August 31st, 1922, in London, where Eve met all of Morty's relatives. It was then that Eve found out just what her husband was really, who her husband just really was. Mortimer Henry Marion Durand was born November 12, 1898, the last of 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. Father Sir Edward Law Durand and mother Maud Ellen Heber Percy. Sir Edward Law Durand was the first baronet of Ruckley Grange in County Shropshire. The baronetcy was created on April 8, 1892, for Sir Edward, British resident of Nepal from 1888 to 1891. He had served on the Afghan Boundary Commission from 84 to 86. That commission established the border between Afghanistan and India. This boundary is still in dispute today by both sides, except now is the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan. About the only way Morty could become a baronet was if all his older brothers predeceased him and had no children. It actually almost happened. Morty was a writer, poet, and Fleet Street journalist, and was educated at Dartmouth and Cambridge in England. During the Abyssinian War with Italy, he wrote a book entitled Crazy Campaign about that war. He lived in Ethiopia at the time. He later wrote several musicals for children, which were never published because the publishers refused to use his illustrations. I wonder what those illustrations looked like. Eve's life in London was one of privilege, and she and Morty moved from apartment to apartment in an effort to, as we say, keep up with the Joneses. Extravagant parties and trips to the theater were the norm. As was customary with the English peerage, Morty commissioned, who's going to be the unveiler? Okay. Morty commissioned Percy Wilde, an English artist, in 1924 to paint an oil portrait of Eve, which is part of the East Haddam Historical Society's art collection. For a while, Eve's portrait hung in the Suffolk Gallery in London, next to a recent portrait of the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VIII, even if for only a few months before his abdication. In late 1924, Morty published his first and most famous novel, Sincérité, a murder mystery in the same genre as those by Agatha Christie. The title refers to the name of a Merlot, which is still produced in the Loire Valley in France to this day. Sincérité had a second printing in 1926. The novel was dedicated to Eve, who was definitely his muse. A review dated November 15, 1924, called Sincérité a very original first novel dealing with the awful effect on a house party by the consumption of too much wine. In between dinner parties, the theater, and Eve's expensive yearly trips back to East Haddam to visit family, Morty started a second novel, The Old Man's Tale, which he never finished. In his many letters to Eve while she was away, he professed his love for her, calling her his darling duck and his puppety lamb, amongst other endearments. He constantly told her he could not work on his second novel without her near him. His letters to her start out with love and then progress to threats that he would leave her or refuse to pay for her trips to America, but then in the end, he would ask for her forgiveness. In 1927, after being so often alone, Morty finally strayed. It was apparently with a woman who he met at the Café Royal in London. Eve was so upset by this act that she overreacted and separated from Morty. In a letter to Eve dated August 1st, 1927, Morty tried to explain, but to no avail. He urges Eve to burn the letter, which she does not. However, she tears away and destroys that part of the second page which may have given the name of the woman involved. He signed the letter Mortimer H.M. Durand. Morty's mother felt that Eve was wrong to have left Morty in what she called a huff. But Morty's oldest sister, Marion Campbell, sided with Eve, and along with other friends such as Lady Nina Martin, suggested that Eve live separately until the situation had been settled. Morty did support Eve financially during the separation. However, Eve never forgave him. To augment her allowance, Eve went back to the acting by joining the cast of Arthur Ridley's new play, The Wrecker, advertised as a train mystery. The play ran 165 performances at the St. Martin's Theatre in London's West End. In a letter to Eve from producer Harry J. Cohen, he wrote that the company was sorry that Eve had decided not to go with the company on tour. Apparently, Eve was not told that on tour meant 40 performances on Broadway, or she might have changed her mind. While on tour, the play was made into a silent black and white movie with a completely different cast. The Wrecker was the story of an old engine driver who thinks his engine is malevolent and self-aware. The play and also the movie ended with a spectacular train wreck. Playwright Arthur Ridley began his career in 1923 and continued with stage plays, film scripts, and television productions until 1975. He died in 1988. Just think, Eve could have played Broadway or become a silent movie star. In 1930, Eve and Morty were divorced, but Eve remained in London, and according to a publicity photo dated March 1930, she continued on stage with her brother-in-law, Baronet Edward Durand, in a period play. That year, Morty published a book of poems written by Durand family members entitled Linked Fantasies. On January 28, 1931, Morty married his second wife, Beatrice Siobhan Sheridan, and they had a son and a daughter. Unable to complete his second novel, The Old Man's Tale, Morty began writing historical books on the exploits of his father, his uncle Mortimer Durand, who was ambassador to Washington, D.C., and other ancestors. During the 1930s, Eve found it difficult to find meaningful work either in England or America. Finally, on July 15, 1938, she departed England for the last time aboard the steamship Berengaria, with all her belongings, including her portrait by artist Percy Wilde, which had hung for a time in the Suffolk Gallery in London next to a recent portrait of the Prince of Wales. In 1942, Eve purchased the small house on Porges Road at the Upper East Haddam landing, where Laura Nichols Bridgman spent her early formative years before becoming a life missionary to the Zulus in Natal, South Africa. Many of you may remember that story I told several years ago. During World War II, Eve was kept busy working for the United States government as an inspector of munitions. She also worked for Sikorsky Aircraft for a while. Her sister Edith married Frank S. Davison of Moodus in May of 1946. After retirement, Eve became a recluse, spending most of her time gardening. Morty died on February 18, 1969, at age 71, before becoming baronet. His older brother Alan outlived him by 2 years. However, fear not, that brother had no children. So the baronetcy passed to Morty's son, the fourth baronet, who was a minister. Sir Henry Mortimer Marion St. George Durand was his name. He died in 1992. Morty's grandson, Edward Allen Durand, is the present 5th baronet, and Morty's great-grandson, Ezra, was born in 2016, and someday will become the 6th baronet of Ruckley Grange in the county of Shropshire, England. I remember Eve in her final years when she came to my office from gardening in her Katharine Hepburn outfit of men's trousers and a shirt, tucked in, of course, and a bandana covering her hair, a la Rosie the Riveter. During all our conversations, I could never get her to talk about her marriage to Morty and why it ended. Eve died on March 16, 1988, at age 83. Her sister Edith Louise died a childless widow in 1990 at age 99. Both are buried with their parents in the northwest corner of First Church Cemetery. Stop by and say hello someday. Finally, it can be said that the identity of the woman in London's Café Royal will remain a mystery, probably forever.